Okay, and welcome everyone to our last Kathy's Corner session of 2023. We're thrilled to have the mighty Kathy Stone, the cornerstone of the entire project KIN, here to talk to us about the whole workflow that she's been discussing these many months, and take us to the tales of yore in our 8 steps. With great pleasure, let me introduce Kathy Stone of Calgary Photo Solutions, and take it away, Kathy.
Thank you, Barbara. I seem to be a little hoarse today. I apologize. So, as Barbara said, we've been going through the 8 steps from tubs of photos to tales of yore. And at the conclusion, instead of starting off with those 8 steps, I'm going to go through them at the conclusion of the session today. But the philosophy we've had since day one of Kathy's Corner was, how do we get all this stuff we need to do to clean up the mess and get our stuff in order so we can get to the good part? And I went back and I looked at the promo from one of the very early sessions, and it was in fact my opening for the first session of Kathy's Corner we did, when I talked about where I got the idea of the good part from was from a song that I liked at the time that was called The Good Part. And one of the chorus lines was, it was spoken and it goes, "Can we get to the good part?" And I thought that applies a lot to organizing our photos, because there's quite a bit of work at the beginning that's kind of dull and time consuming, and we tend to get frustrated. So what I tried to do with Kathy's Corner was distill my experience and knowledge and workflows as a professional photo manager into a process that you could follow to get your photos and stories into your life and your legacy told, which to me is the good part, where we start talking about the stories and enjoying our photos as opposed to them becoming a burden. And so guess what? Hang on here. There it is. I'll find the advanced button. We've reached the good part. We're at step 7 of telling your story. And so excuse me. So this was just a little bit of one where, and we also talked about working on a project basis, which is, I think, has really evolved into one of the another cornerstone, I guess, of Project KIN, is that the process a professional photo manager uses, I do each step for the entire collection all at once. But when we're dealing with our own photos, we don't have to do that. We can pick and choose what we want. And so I had started back at around the same time, maybe sometime last year, and I picked a part for my family history that had a fixed date to start with. And so this is a picture of my grandparents and my aunt and uncle when they arrived in a little town called Vermilion, Alberta in 1929, when they immigrated from England. And the story that is there was told by my aunt in her memoirs that described the arrival. There's much more to it. But this is what it's all about, is taking that picture, which you look at that picture and go, well, that's neat. I wonder what it's all about. And so that's the whole part of telling our stories and where we're at now after we've done all the other digitization and everything. So what is the part of the telling your stories? Once you've got all the digital, the photos are all digitized and we've got them all in some sort of order. Next, what we want to do is update the descriptions of the photos or the album as a whole, depending on what software we use. And depending on the nature of the photo, you may be able to put a description on an entire album and tell the story there. Or you may go picture by picture, and it's entirely up to you. And it would depend a lot on what the stories are. Because I may tell, with all the pictures I have of my grandparents and their farm, I might tell a general story at the beginning of the album, similar to what was on that one picture, and then be more specific on each picture. And so what do you want to add to this? And I use the description field. It depends on your software. Sometimes it's called the caption, but this isn't what I put in the title or the file name, put it that way. I don't put this in the file. This is what I'm writing in the description area. And so some clues for what you want to write about. What do you know at the moment about that moment? Like, what do I know about that moment as it was happening? What change was happening at that moment? Well, obviously, for me, as my mother was the first family member born in Canada, that story is of huge importance because I was, again, as also I was born in Canada, but that's where the whole next generation started in Canada, was after my grandparents came here. So what change was happening there? And why was this important? And again, I've said that. Why was this so important? It was because it was it was the start of our life no longer being in England, but starting in Canada. Also, I forgot to mention at the beginning, if you have any questions, just throw them in the chat, and Barbara will interrupt me and ask the questions as we go. All right. So telling the story, and this is the part why I enjoy this so much too, is because it's way easier than all the rest of the work. There's really nothing technical about this. So you can add information to tell the story to the metadata fields. And we used that term, talked a bit about it last week, and I haven't really gone into it too much because our guest on December 5th, Barbara could correct me if I'm wrong, is Carolyn Gunter, who is like just a whiz. She's one of my photo manager colleagues, and she's a genealogist and a photo organizer, and she's going to talk to us a bit about the importance of metadata in our family history photos. So I'm not going to talk too much about the what's of it, but also just you can add things such as location, keywords, tags. So for example, that photo I showed a few minutes ago, I may put a tag in the or in the location field. I might put a link to Google showing where that farm was. Or I could get more creative in my projects, and I could make a map that showed their journey from England over on the ship, and then the train across Canada, and they landed in Vermilion, and then on that wagon they're riding on where they were taken out to the farm where they farmed. You can add anything. What do you remember about the moment? If it's a picture that you were involved in, what were you told about it? What do you think about the moment? Like, to me, what's important about that moment is, again, it triggers so many things for me. Is like, what possessed I know my grandfather always wanted to be a farmer, but I think, what did my grandma think about this? Because she just came along and she left her whole family, and they both did, just to come here. So, and then you can also link to any other photos that will expand on the story. Come on, click. There we go. I think I clicked too far. Tell your story. No, I didn't. So that was step 7, was telling the story. And like I said, we're at the part now, the good part, where it's pretty easy. And just remembering those stories. Step 8 was, click. Now it won't go. Hang on here. See, I knew I could not make it through without a text. Oh, there we go. Hang on. There. The last step, step 8, was add the wisdom of your crowd. Or people remember things differently. We've been told different stories. We may have had different conversations with people in our family about various events. And this is the opportunity to have everyone collaborate on the stories and let others comment. You can invite family members to collaborate on the stories, either on an individual photo or a whole album of photos. It's the opportunity to enrich the story and possibly even correct information. You can do this by sharing photos online, having people to comment. You could use some kind of a software that allows that, the online sharing, and then people can just put their comments in. I always say you may want to be the one who edits this, as opposed to just letting everybody type right over on the originals. You might want to collect the information and then put it all together. You could record people or video them discussing their memories of a certain event or the stories they've been told, and then add the video or the audio of it to attach it to those photos, and so that it becomes a really good gift to pass on for future generations to hear people telling those stories in their own voices. You could set up a virtual meeting with family to gather input. I call that part of the fun part, to get together and just have everybody tell their stories and record it. And then you could decide, I'm going to just type it all in, or I'm going to just add some of the recordings. Lots and lots of different ways to do that, and to enrich those photographs, because the old saying of a picture's worth 1,000 words, not so much. I've looked at a lot of pictures and gone, I wonder what that was. And the significance and all those things aren't necessarily obvious. And you don't need to do you don't need to do every single photo. Like if you've got them in an album or a folder, you can just describe, okay, these pictures are all from this part of here, and tell the story there. And then with that background context, then a picture might be worth 1,000 words once you have that background context. My grandfather was a member of the Veterans Guard of Canada, and he was a guard in Kananaskis, which is here in the mountains, where they had a prisoner of war camp. And Rommel's troops, when they were captured in Africa, were sent to the Camp 130 here in the Rockies, and my grandfather was a guard there. I've got quite a few photos of his time there and various pictures of the drills and them on duty and the facility and the area around it. So, but if I tell that story first, I don't necessarily need to add a big description on each and every picture, because then the pictures make sense once you know the background. So that's the fun part. How do I do this? That's always a question, and people are probably going through your mind is, well, what software should I use to do this? And Barbara and I have always kind of taken an approach here that we're not married to any particular software. We're not going to recommend and say you must use this software. We'll talk about different ones. I think both of us at different times will share what we use. But what's important to know is that you know what you want ahead of time. What do you want to do in terms of this piece, or even the organization and everything else? What's the important things that you want from a software? And then that becomes a guide for you when you come across a software. In different groups, I frequently say, oh, well, I've heard about this. Has anybody heard about those photo sticks that they advertise to us all the time on Facebook that say they'll gather and organize all your photos? Was that and it's figure out what you want the software to do first, and then you'll probably get an answer to your questions, because you could simply say, does this software do these things? What things are we talking about? Barbara did a session again quite a while ago. We were just talking about this. Might be time to revisit it too. Called The 5 Elements You Need for Digital Family History Projects. And so I thought, well, let's just look over those now that we've been through the whole organizing process. Let's talk about everything we've been talking about. The first step that I think is that it's digital, that you've digitized. It's critical to preserve them, and it's also critical for the sharing and the storytelling, and the linking together is to take advantage of what we have in the digital world. And we did talk about two sessions ago, we talked about how to archivally preserve the physical photos, but they're not really that convenient to share and look at, where that's what the advantage is of digital. We talked a lot about organizing by faces. People are the key to how we think about our families. So a software that will allow you to organize by faces, or at minimum will allow you to tag faces easily and sort by face easily, is probably a really good one of the things we really want. Of course, key to this, the storytelling. That your software will create a way to tell stories where all kinds of new opportunities and obligations are created. And that just means that we have more ways developing to take advantage of things like AI, artificial intelligence, and anything new that comes along, that we want a way to tell the stories that takes advantage of those things. The last two, step 4 and step 5, are that they're archived. Proper archiving is vital to long-term preservation because you don't want to lose anything. And archived also means for the digital part. And we want both archived and backed up, because as much as we don't want to lose the paper, we don't want to lose the digital either once you've done all this work on it. So, and we've talked, I think there's some other sessions that have been done in the past about the differences between backing up and syncing and all those things. There's some sessions that will be in the Project Kin archives that you can check back on, or you feel free to ask questions about them. And we want it to be private but shareable. I don't want to put my entire family history, even though some of my family members like to do that. I don't want it all on Facebook. I don't want everybody's names. I don't want everybody's birth dates. All that information, don't want it on Facebook. Some of the genealogical programs, Ancestry, Family Tree, have varying degrees of privacy, and that's a choice again that you make. But as this says, the story you tell changes on depending on who is or who might be listening. There's lots more to the background stories about my grandparents and my aunts and uncles on the farm, some of which I will tell to family and some of which I don't think need to be made public. Not that they were horrific things, but some of the ways, some of the things that happened during that time period. Because if you come to a prairie province to farm right before the Great Depression, that wasn't necessarily the best of times, but there may be parts of those stories that I wouldn't want to be put in public. So the true stories need a private, safe space to be. And I don't know, Barbara, if you can pop that link into the chat. That's the link to the article on those 5 steps.
Okay, well, in a minute.
Thank you.
And yeah, context is everything.
Pardon?
Context is everything.
Yes. All right. So I said we'd go through, and I'm going to I'll run through the 8 steps, but and then I could stop showing my screen and we can talk, because I hate not being able to see your faces. Just to review, what were those 8 steps? Gather was our first step. Once you've gathered everything, plan the scope of your work, and then start to sort it into however. I think I talked a lot about sorting by the way it needs to be digitized, because that's in the next step. That's the next step, is to digitize. So if you sort things in, and we talked about, the spreadsheets are up there about identifying if I've got a videotape and photos and documents of the same event, I might want to give them a numbering code, so when I digitize them, I could look at the digital and reunite all those pieces that belong together. Archive your originals and your digital files. Organize the digital files. That's what we talked about last month. And then what we're talking about today, tell the stories and add the wisdom of your crowd. So I am going to stop sharing my screen. Maybe because I hid the thing that says stop sharing my screen, so now I don't know where it is. There. Oh, that was easy. So, questions or comments? Thank you, Marcy.
Just to jump in here, Kathy, I couldn't help myself as you were talking about this. I don't know if you've ever seen or heard or watched the video versions of Hamilton, but there's a wonderful chorus of the room where it happened. And I can just hear it in my ear. And I always think about that expression because, the story you tell does depend on who's listening.
Mm-hmm.
A true story. And as opposed, and in a sense, when you're publishing a story for anybody who cares to watch, it's a little bit different because in a sense it's the lowest common denominator of what the consequences might be of someone else hearing the story. I have lots of stories of racist, sexist, and otherwise inappropriate comments made by beloved family members, and it's context helps understand why I still love them and all of those kinds of things. And just to gloss over the obvious categories, but there are many other kinds of awkward things that are important to talk about in a family. And those are great examples of these are the golden moments, but they're also, learning opportunities. And that's
and I think it's one thing that in all my years from starting out helping people make scrapbooks has always been the do I only scrapbook the happy events, or do I only put the happy photos in, and do I only tell the happy stories, or am I telling a life story? Because we all know life isn't life. If you're lucky, maybe life isn't all just one happy road from birth to death. There's all sorts of things that happen in it, and even more and more now. I think I've mentioned before, I have divorces in my family. We have divorces, remarriages. We have, I have cousins who were given up for adoption, that some that I only found out a few years, and I'm not that young, only a few years ago, that there were more cousins that were given up for adoption, and been fortunate to track them all down and have a wonderful relationship now. But so for them, what do we tell those people for a story? And do you just say, oh, it was all wonderful, we all had a wonderful life, or do you say there were tough times too? I know a friend of mine who, in scrapbooking, her daughter, we were all in Canadian Scouting together, and her daughter, because we let girls in Scouting in Canada, her daughter got leukemia when she was 5, and my kids were 6. And so she was she made an entire scrapbook back then. This is quite a while ago. And I'll cheer you all up by saying Kylie is now a happy, healthy 26-year-old. She's having her birthday this week. So, but it was, some people were sort of taken aback that when we were together in group scrapbooking, that she was scrapbooking Kylie's journey. She had all the diagnosis, it was all in the book. They got beads, the kids got little beads every time they had pokes or needles or treatments. And so those were all going in the book. And a lot of people were like, oh, that's kind of weird. And it's just no, this is right now, this is what our life is. This is do we just have a big blank hole for those bad years where we never went anywhere, we didn't do anything, we didn't hardly see any people because we couldn't have people in our house? Or do we just tell what this story was like and what it was like for her older brother? And because he just sort of he had to go wait in the back. He got pushed to the back during this time because all the amount of energy. And so to me, that's part of their life. That's part of their story. And particularly it's part of Kylie's story, because it's her life going forward too.
It's a really interesting insight. And I think about it a little bit. I too, my parents divorced when I was in diapers. I was a little tiny thing. And my mom went through, probably out of her own feelings, and eliminated all photographs of my dad. So I had 0 photographs of myself with my dad when I was little. It just didn't happen. And I think, that was a matter of the time, and I think today, when we think about media in a much more plastic way, a much more malleable way, we don't even begin to think about media as everything goes on television, on broadcast television. Of course not. Everything is a magazine. Of course not. But we have kinds of gradations of who an audience is for media in ways that were never even conceivable just 20 years ago. And so it's not surprising that it's taken us a while to really think about how family storytelling might change. And I think that, now that you bring it up, to me, it's one of the key things that we're trying to do here. It's a great point.
Well, and I think it's connected to, if we're telling our family history, our legacy, leaving our legacy, to me, that's part of it. It's
Absolutely.
not, it's not you don't just put the good parts in.
Well, but you did. I guess my point is, in the old days, why do you have to talk about such unpleasantness?
Yes, exactly.
And it was cultural. It was a
Yeah.
cultural thing. You don't need to have to dwell on unpleasantness
No,
of the past.
exactly. Yeah.
And I think we have a different attitude, and maybe it's just a current cultural attitude, that these kinds of things that we all benefit in terms of learning and understanding and contextualizing, when you actually talk about it, even if it's unpleasant, even if there's conflict in the process, or
Well,
it
and
makes us
it's
uncomfortable.
another good example is when you go back to like when you first start doing your family research and you're at that stage where you're writing down everyone's birthdays and the days they got tied, the dates they got married and everything, and you go, oh, wait a minute.
Oh,
That
counting
wedding,
months, are you?
let me count the months here from the wedding to the kid's first birthday. There's not quite enough months in that period. But that's from the 40s. But that you never,
Right.
the whole thing, you never talked about that. It wasn't like, oh, yeah, and, this is, and then you sort of think, okay, well, that could have been a reason why the wedding happened at that point in time. But you never talked about that in the, even when I was a kid, never got talked about.
No.
But so it's just, and it's that sort of decision making as the historian is what you want to do. And also, I know in a lot of the ancestry family tree programs, what's the big one that's on the LDS Church?
Family
I'm a
search.
member, and they do.
Family search.
Thank you. Roots Tech, the whole there. You can't see anyone who's still living. You can't in someone else's tree. If you could see the people who have passed, but you can't see someone even like even if I invited you to my tree, you can't see anyone who's still alive.
Well,
Only I
I
can
would
see it.
argue that's a very good thing from a privacy perspective, because
Yeah.
judging
Yeah.
from the other kinds of things that are tossed in there with varying degrees of accuracy.
No, exactly. And I think that's a good thing because I think that does provide that layer of privacy for
Right.
for that. So
Yeah, exactly.
yeah, so that's where we're at. So we can just pop this back up. Maybe I am. Window, that's what I'm looking for. There we go. So, oh, I don't have any, you can just look at that smaller one. Oh, because I got to tell it to run a slideshow. Hang on. There we go. So we've been through the 8 steps through the course of this year. And so Barbara and I have questions for you about what we should do next for Kathy's Corner. We want to keep having this, but we want your input on what would be important for you to do. I put a few questions up. Should I start over at step 1 and do the steps over again? It would be different somewhat and somewhat the same.
May I suggest, Kathy, that before we dive into this larger discussion, which I think is going to be very important, as well as some of the kinds of changes that we have coming for Project Kin itself, why don't I go ahead and stop the recording so that we can feel more comfortable chatting,
Okay.
and the recorded portion will all know that this conversation happened.
Yes.
Doesn't have to go through all of the details. How about that? Goodbye, future. We'll talk to you later.
There. And we probably don't really need the overheads. I can just pose some of my suggestions at times, but
I'm stopping the recording.
okay, very good.